Quoting Byrne, a woman's sexuality is often not her own and belongs to her family, community, or male partner. But there is a growing global consensus that sexual rights are human rights that cultures cannot deny and must protect. In order to understand why sexual rights must be protected, we need to first understand what they are and their importance. So, sexual rights are human rights related to sexuality. This includes the rights of people to make personal decisions about their sexuality and their sexual activity. This includes rights based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and LGBTQIA+ rights. As I said, women's sexuality is often restricted and defined by others, and those who challenge such norms tend to face hostility. And I've included this quote from the beginning of the chapter as well because I just love how matter-of-fact and straightforward it is. Women have sexual rights. They want it when they want it. They don't want it when they don't want it. And you had better listen. Being able to frame sexual inequalities in terms of human rights helps women assert that they are human beings who demand and deserve respect and rights over their sexuality regardless of common cultural beliefs and practices. Casting sexual rights as human rights helps women reclaim their sexuality instead of it being defined solely in terms of its service to male partners, family, and community. There is a growing global consensus that sexual rights are human rights that cultures cannot deny and must protect. But this acceptance is relatively new and tentative, the result of years of activism. In fact, it was not until the 1990s that sexual rights were put on the human rights agenda, and not without quite a bit of struggle. In 1995, the UN held what's called the World Conference on Women in Beijing, and it was there that sexual and reproductive rights were hotly debated. Of particular concern to many countries was language in draft documents referring to sexual orientation. Ultimately, this language had to be dropped, and women's sexual and reproductive rights were defined in the final Beijing Platform for Action, as including the rights of women to, as the quote says here, have control over and decide freely and responsibly on matters related to their sexuality, including sexual and reproductive health, free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. Equal relationships between women and men in matters of sexual relations and reproduction, including full respect for the integrity of the person, require mutual respect, consent, and shared responsibility for sexual behavior and its consequences. A bit later on, in 2007, there was what's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and what we see listed here on the left are many of those as they relate to the concept of sexual rights. A further extension of this then was in 2008 when the International Planned Parenthood Federation released what they call the Declaration of Sexual Rights. According to the Declaration, sexual rights encompass sexual activity, gender identities, and sexual orientation. Sexual rights require a commitment to negative rights, such as protection from sexuality-related harm. They also include positive rights, such as the right to pursue sexual pleasure and to choose one's own partner. The same year, at the General Assembly of the United Nations, 66 countries from 5 continents agreed to a statement confirming that international human rights protections include sexual orientation and gender identity. A little bit later, in 2015, all 12 UN agencies, including UN Women and the World Health Organization, issued a joint statement calling for an end to discrimination based on actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics. The statement calls for repealing discriminatory laws and protecting individuals from discrimination. It promises support to UN member nations for changes that will protect, promote, and fulfill the rights of all LGBTQIA+ people. Having such documents and agreements in place and internationally recognized is just one piece of a larger solution. In order to bring about real change, we need to understand how and why women's sexuality is perceived and defined cross-culturally. So, let's take a jump in at the first and most dominant form of culture we have in the world today and look at how women's sexual identities are constructed in heteronormative and patriarchal cultures. In these sorts of societies, Women's sexuality is tied to what women want. They are sexualized when it suits men. And among psychoanalysts such as Sigmund Freud, who first identified this condition, what's called a Madonna whore complex is said to develop in men who see women as either saintly Madonnas or debased prostitutes. In order to minimize their anxiety, a man categorizes women into two groups: women he can admire and women he finds sexually attractive. Whereas the man loves women in the former category, he despises and devalues the latter group. This type of mindset has manifested most recently as the incel internet subculture, in other words, which is defined as involuntary celibate. And these are individuals who are unable to find a partner despite wanting one. And this particular subculture has contributed to some recent mass murder events targeting women. Another theory claims that the Madonna whore complex derives from the alleged representations of women as either Madonnas or whores in mythology and Judeo-Christian theology, rather than developmental disabilities of individual men. And even more recently than that, a study has discussed that whereas prior theories focused on unresolved sexual complexes or evolved psychological tendencies, recent feminist theory suggests that the Madonna whore complex actually stems from a desire to reinforce the patriarchy. Within patriarchal societies, therefore, it's pretty easy to understand why a singer such as Madonna herself was seen as so controversial early on in her career. So what about the men? Men's sexuality is the opposite. Men tend to be rewarded for their sexual promiscuity and are able to openly express it without consequence. Many cultures, in this sense, have what's called a sexual double standard, where women's sexuality is defined in terms of monogamy, passivity, and receptivity to male partners, while men's sexual urges are believed to be uncontrollable, such that they are not expected to be monogamous. Traditional masculinity norms in gender unequal societies lead men to control sexual decision-making. And in some cultures, women's sexuality is defined in terms of women as objects of men's sexual satisfaction. So how do cultural norms and socialization affect women's sexuality and sexual identities in patriarchal societies? Well, unfortunately, we've all become a little too familiar with what's called rape culture. And this involves cultural practices that excuse or tolerate sexual violence by ignoring, trivializing, or normalizing it. Rape culture is unfortunately entrenched in society at ideological, institutional, and individual levels. Women in this sense are seen as submissive, vulnerable, and weak, objects of desire and subordinate figures to their husbands, which forms a power relationship that is very much unequal. This then begs the question, if a woman's sexuality is not her own, then what is being expressed and reproduced in our society? Is it the expression of women's sexuality, or is it the expression of men's interpretation of women's sexuality? What we learn from social learning theory is that audiences are more likely to buy a product if the advertising narrative is easily recognizable and frequently repeated. So, when we see the repetition of men's views of women's sexuality, it's unsurprising that we grow to accept, or at least expect, those behaviors. A particularly prominent example is taking a look at the last 40 years of Rolling Stone covers, and what we see is that in the 1960s, 11% of men and 44% of women appeared as being sexualized. However, jump to the 2000s, and we see that men are holding steady around 17% being sexualized, whereas 83% of women were sexualized on the front covers. One prominent example of this is the sexualization of Asian women. If women are seen as submissive and exotic, then Asian women are most likely to fit that sort of stereotype. In particular is the fetishization and sexualization of them as geishas, China dolls, lotus blossoms, or dragon flowers. Dragon ladies. And this actually derives from a complete misconception. So geishas in this sense are not just an Eastern equivalent of a prostitute. In fact, traditional geishas didn't really engage in any kind of sexual activities. It was this misconception from Western interactions with Orient Japanese courtesans who dressed quite similarly, but it's a different cultural practice. Of course, this is not a U.S. problem only. We see this sort of advertising taking place in other countries as well. Here we're seeing other sorts of patriarchal societies, I should say. Here we're seeing a lottery ad from Lebanon, as well as an ad for a hair salon in Germany. Another more recent example comes from Egypt. It was a series of non-alcoholic beer ads that were focused on the sexualization of women to promote their brand. The ads themselves were published in Egypt, where there is an overwhelming majority of women, 99.3%, who have experienced some sort of sexual harassment, and 96.5% of women have been sexually assaulted. And this was according to a report by the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women in April 2013. Many of these over-sexualized ads were acceptable until they went too far, and the ad actually had nothing to do with women. So this was a commercial that was put out in which one man took a sly glance at another man at the urinal, and then the tagline of it was 30 years of Burrell, the beer, and there are still guys like this. Well, it was only then that there was finally this sort of social uproar, but not at the stake of women being sexualized for years. It was once it turned into, a sort of questioning of male sexuality that people actually had a problem. So let's look at the other end of the spectrum. How do women's sexual identities get constructed in what we call matriarchal cultures? And for that, we look to one small ethnic group within China. They are the Mosuo. They live very close to the Tibetan border. These people live in large extended families that are capable of being self-sufficient through farming and the raising of livestock. These families trace their lineage through the female side of the family, so they are considered a matriarchal society and are often referred to as China's last matrilineal society. The matriarch, or elder female, is the head of the household. She has absolute power over those living under her roof. She's responsible for most of the housework and financial decisions, and also manages the money and jobs of each family member. When she wishes to pass her duties on to the next generation, she gives her successor the keys to the household storage, thus signifying the passing on of property rights and responsibility. Now, the Mosuo are famous for one of their practices, which is what is called a walking marriage. And although this practice remains poorly understood, what we do know is that both partners live under the roof of their respective extended families during the day. However, at night it is common for the man to visit and stay at the woman's house, if given permission, until sunrise. Therefore, they do not technically live in the same household, but they are free to visit when granted permission. Children of parents in a walking marriage are not raised by their father, however. The brothers of the mother, that is the child's maternal uncle or uncles, those are the ones who take on the responsibilities of the father, since the father isn't typically around during the day. So their uncles play a very large role in the development of children. After the birth of a child, a man has no moral, cultural, or legal obligation to take care of the child. Instead, it's the woman's extended family that helps to raise the children and allows both the man and the woman to engage in sexual relations with whomever they please. In this sort of society, other sorts of inconspicuous advantages of participating in a walking marriage include the fact that there's no divorce because the man and the woman are not legally bound together. There's no disputes over who owns custody of the child, since the child belongs to the mother's extended family and takes the mother's last name. And finally, in the case of a parent's death, the child is cared for by the extended family. So a very particularly interesting case study to consider in opposition to those we just looked at among patriarchal societies. So for the activity for this week, and I'm still working on getting us access to this film because it seems particularly well suited to what we're talking about this week. I want you to hopefully be able to watch the film, and for your activity, I want you to summarize and compare two of the case studies that are presented, and I've given you a few questions here to think over while doing that. I'll post an announcement as soon as a link to the video is made available, and you will be able to take the rest of the week to watch the film and complete your assignment. All right, that's it.